Hello learners, my name is Dr. Shubhangi Vaidya and I am Associate Professor in the School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies of IGNOU. Today's module will discuss poverty and development. Why is it important to discuss poverty and development? Well, as people who are working with NGOs and have an interest in NGO management, it is very important for you to be conversant with some of the key and critical issues that are being faced by many people in our society. And poverty certainly is one of them. So in today's talk, we'll be covering the concept of poverty and development and looking at poverty as a multi-dimensional phenomenon. In other words, we'll be looking at its social, economic, cultural and other dimensions, and we will be trying to understand the concept of poverty in an holistic perspective. We will also consider the issue of development and try to understand development better, not just as an economic phenomenon, but as something which impacts the life chances and the progress of all human beings in a society. So with this very brief introduction, let's get down to actually discussing some of the important issues in this particular lecture. So what is poverty? We use the word so very often. Whenever we think of poverty, we see various images in our mind. Images of hunger, images of lack of the ability to lead a decent life, of people whose clothing, whose houses, whose status of health care is not of an order that we can consider as being very favorable to human development. The famous economist Adam Smith said, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of members are poor and miserable." In very simple terms, poverty can be defined as a situation wherein people are unable to satisfy the basic needs of life. However, as I have mentioned, poverty is a very complex and multifaceted condition which has economic, social, cultural, historical and political dimensions, about which we will discuss a little bit later. Poverty basically is a lack of access to basic requirements, to nutritious food, to education, to medical care, housing and decent work. In other words, a poor person is a person who is probably not able to sleep in the night with a full stomach, who is unable to ensure 2 decent meals for his family, who probably cannot send a child to school, who may be in a real crisis if there is any medical emergency in the family. In other words, poverty is a situation of extreme vulnerability, a situation in which individuals are not really in charge of their lives simply because of the condition of being deprived of their basic wants. Now, poverty has been measured and quantified in many ways, but the bottom line is that it is a deprivation of those social goods which are needed for a dignified life. So who are the poor? Poor people are people who we see all around us doing myriads of activities. For instance, selling items on radies or push carts, rag pickers, people living in slums, laborers working in construction sites. We see poverty in a sense all around us. However, economists identify the poor on the basis of their occupation and their ownership of assets. So when we speak about the poor or the rural poor, immediately in our minds we think of landless laborers, small and marginal cultivators, agricultural laborers, tenant cultivators and so on. These are rural poor who basically do not have their own land which they can cultivate for a sustainable livelihood. These are people who live in situations of extreme vulnerability, toiling on the fields of others. And because agriculture is a seasonal occupation, there are times of the year when these agricultural laborers or marginal cultivators find themselves without any work. And this is a period of particular vulnerability for them. We speak of this as disguised unemployment and seasonal unemployment. We also have the urban poor, and those of us who live in big cities, we see them all around us. Migrants from rural areas who flood the cities in search of livelihoods. Laborers, casual workers, self-employed people, street vendors, and so on. In the current situation caused by COVID, the issue of the poor and the marginalized has come into focus as never before. Because of the precariousness of their condition, a sudden cataclysmic event like a pandemic can completely disrupt their lives and livelihoods, as we have seen all too clearly and poignantly. The poor and the non-poor. These two huge categories of people in society are basically separated by an analytical construct known as the poverty line. So what exactly is this poverty line? The poverty line is an idea or a concept through which we are able to assess those who are poor and those who are not poor. Let's talk about this a little more. We also have to speak about absolute poverty and relative poverty. Absolute poverty refers to a situation in which the household income is below a certain level, which makes it impossible for the person or the family to meet their basic needs of life, including food, shelter, safe drinking water, education, healthcare, and so on. Relative poverty. This refers to a situation wherein people falling under this category are not living in total poverty, as in the case of absolute poverty, which we've just spoken about. However, they are not enjoying the same standard of life as everyone else in the country. In other words, relative to others, they are in a state of deprivation. In very poor countries, we find that absolute poverty as a concept is relevant because there are sections of the population which really don't have access to even the basic needs or the basic goods needed to sustain life. However, more and more, we find that relative poverty is a more valid and a more explanatory concept. Because even in the richest of countries, you will find that not everybody is leading the same kind of life. There are poor people even in rich or well-to-do societies and nations. And this is where the concept of relative poverty becomes important. So we had mentioned the poverty line. Let's see how in India we identify and measure poverty. So here in India, we measure poverty on the basis of daily intake of food. According to the definition by the Planning Commission of India, the poverty line is drawn at an intake of 2,400 calories in rural areas and 2,100 calories in urban areas. If a person is unable to get that minimum level of calories, then he or she is considered to be living below the poverty line. And the consumption basket, which represents this calorific intake, is then converted into a money equivalent or a monetary equivalent by using the price indices separately for rural and urban areas. Because as you know, the cost of living varies in towns and cities. So this very, very basic definition of poverty, in other words, is an individual able to fulfill their daily nutritional requirement or not? However, we do find that poverty is a lot more than just being able to keep body and soul together. As we have mentioned earlier, poverty also refers to multiple other factors like access to education, access to medical care, access to political participation, access to social respect. So there are many, many factors which affect the lives of persons who we call poor. So what does poverty look like? Well, persons who are poor have limited assets, very few goods, very few items in their home perhaps, low income and landlessness as we had earlier mentioned. They may have very less savings, they may be heavily indebted, they may be under a lot of debt, they may have very low consumption. Lack of employment security is also a very, very crucial aspect of poverty. Food insecurity, which results from lack of employment security, and as I have mentioned earlier, precarity, a situation of precariousness wherein there is no certainty from one day to the next whether they will be able to earn enough to consume 2 square meals. A very, very important aspect here is the existence of illiteracy. Due to lack of proper education, formal education and training, we find that large swathes of people who are poor are unable to improve their lives because they lack the education and training to improve their life chances. Poverty is also associated with poor quality housing. All of us have seen urban slums. All of us have seen the kinds of conditions in which many people in rural areas live. We are very, very well familiar with the issues of sanitation, the poor quality of sanitation, garbage disposal and so on, and its immediate impact on health and overall well-being of people living in these areas. So let's talk a little bit more about what poverty looks like. Poverty is also associated with marginalization. What do we mean by marginalization? Marginalization means being out of the mainstream, on the margins of society or on the outer edges of society where there is very little opportunity to be involved with mainstream activities. In other words, we find that poor people are routinely kept out or excluded from the activities of society, from the prestige and the status that other members of society would get. We also find that poor people are in competition with each other for very scarce resources. You only have to think about the way in which something like potable water in a deprived community becomes such an important item of survival, and the way in which people are literally fighting with each other for access to that clean or potable water. Vulnerability and easy prey to all kinds of exploitation is also a dimension or an aspect of being poor. Low social status, low self-esteem, feeling hopeless, feeling that there is really no way ahead in life. And if you are living from hand to mouth, living on a daily basis, just trying to make the ends meet and manage from the morning to the evening, then well, the prospect of future plans, the prospect of future prospects seems very, very remote and hard to achieve. So it is this kind of a situation of deprivation, of marginalization, of vulnerability and lack of any foreseeable happy future that really characterizes the life of the poorest of the poor among us. To carry on the theme of marginalization and exclusion a bit further, we find that there are certain specific categories of people in our society who experience a disproportionately greater amount of marginalization and exclusion. We find that the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes have historically been subjected to discrimination and have not really been included in the mainstream of society. The caste system, wherein certain marginalized communities or marginalized classes have been reduced or have been relegated to performing certain menial occupations, which really do not give them any avenues for social mobility, has been a very, very important factor in keeping a large section of the population below the poverty line. Another very important aspect is the gender dimension. We find that women suffer from far greater deprivations in terms of access to nutrition, access to healthcare and education. In times of want or in times of crisis, we find that it is routinely their interests which are sacrificed. So if there is a crisis in the household, if somebody has to go without food, almost inevitably we will see that it is the women and the girls of the family whose interests, whose desires, whose needs will be sacrificed over and above that of the male. We find that women also experience a good deal of violence and abuse. Poor women particularly may be subjected to a lot of domestic violence, violence at the workplace, violence in public spaces on account of their increased vulnerability and their lack of voice. Because they are unable to articulate their issues, they are unable to find a proper forum wherein their difficulties, the problems that they face will be listened to respectfully. So we find that gender plays a very, very important role in the way in which poverty is experienced. And the condition of poor women, we find, we call them multiple marginalizations. So being poor and being female, both are marginal identities, and when you are a poor woman, it means that you experience both the deprivation of poverty as well as the discrimination of gender in a far more acute way. So this is a very, very important point to be kept in mind. Other categories of persons who routinely experience marginalization, exclusion, and enhanced poverty are persons with disabilities, people with chronic illness, the elderly, and because of their health conditions, these people actually lose livelihoods, they lack social security, they have very few avenues to interact, to basically network with people, and this leads to increased vulnerability. We know that a number of NGOs are particularly dedicated to working with these categories of marginalized and excluded persons. And that is why it is very, very important to understand the different layers of marginalization and exclusion that these categories of people experience. So why is there poverty in India? What are some of the reasons for it? It's important to have a look so that we can contextualize and understand the nature of endemic poverty in our country a little better. One of the most important reasons is historical. You all know that India has experienced 2 centuries of colonial rule, which is basically 2 centuries of exploitation. During the colonial period, we find that during the 200 years of colonial rule, we find that the traditional industries, the traditional livelihoods, the whole village economy of India was ruined because India was basically seen as a provider of raw materials to the West. This was also a period of acute famines, a period wherein the entire traditional structure which had existed in pre-colonial period was destroyed and was exploited by colonial rulers for their own ends. At the time India attained freedom, we were a country that had suffered exploitation at the hands of the colonial masters and the terrible, terrible consequences of partition. As a result, levels of poverty, levels of hunger, and levels of deprivation were very, very high at the time of partition. Over the years, succeeding governments have placed poverty alleviation really at the forefront of their agendas. And we can certainly say that 70 years after independence, the kind of grinding poverty that existed in the past has been ameliorated to a large extent. Even though there is no way we can say that poverty as such has been eradicated, poverty still exists. However, the kinds of levels of poverty that existed a few decades ago has certainly seen an improvement. Another very important factor is the social structural dimensions. As I've mentioned before, we find that the existence and the persistence of the caste system and social hierarchies, which restrict the mobility of certain categories of people, which really trap them or imprison them in certain manual and extremely unproductive occupations, wherein they spend their entire lives and in a sense in which they are bonded from generation to generation with very little hope of escape. This is a kind of a structural system, or this is a kind of a social system wherein which poverty tends to be inbuilt. We also see that the pressures of a huge population, so many mouths to feed, limited resources, environmental degradation, all these have led to a situation of poverty persisting and great difficulties really in ameliorating poverty. Overdependence on agriculture as the sole means of livelihood is also a very, very important factor. As mentioned earlier, this leads to seasonal and disguised unemployment. As generations succeed, we find that the same plot of land tends to be subdivided and fragmented between the descendants, leading to a situation where agriculture becomes unsustainable. Those tiny little parcels of land are really not able to be economically viable. Illiteracy and lack of employment opportunities, as earlier mentioned, and also certain economic policies in the post-independence period, which have been heavily criticized by many scholars as being skewed, or rather being in the favor of certain categories of the economic system and leaving out or excluding large numbers of people who really need development, who really need chances to rise up the economic and social ladder. Let's talk a little bit about poverty and development now. So what do we understand by development? Development is commonly understood to be a systematic and positive change in the physical quality of life of the people in an area or in a country. Development basically means a better distribution of the gains from progress, material and social welfare, as well as equitable distribution of income and opportunities. So basically it means a qualitative improvement in living conditions, particularly of those affected by poverty, illiteracy, and poor health conditions. Now, the traditional concept or notion of development placed more emphasis on economic growth. But growth alone, economic growth alone, is not sufficient. Distribution is critical. And we see that the problem of inequality continues to be an intractable and a major problem. We find that real and sustainable development is based upon equity and social justice. Let me explain the difference between equality and equity here. Equality basically means when something is equally divided amongst all. Equity, however, is a more complex concept. Equity means that depending upon the condition of the individual, depending upon the kind of social deprivations an individual faces, that individual should be given a better chance or should be given better opportunities than another person. So equity basically includes or incorporates a notion of social justice. Talking about social justice, a very, very important scholar who spoke and wrote a lot about poverty is the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. Sen gave a very, very interesting approach to the problem of poverty. His approach is known as the capabilities approach. So rather than looking simply at economic dimensions or simply looking at incomes, Sen's approach towards poverty and towards development focus upon people and their capabilities. And it provides an alternative perspective on issues like poverty, inequality, gender bias, social exclusion, etc., which are hardly touched by a strictly economic understanding of development. So for Sen, poverty is understood as deprivation of basic capabilities. For example, ignorance, lack of financial resources, ill health, lack of proper education, sudden accidents, etc., would deprive an individual of his or her ability to realize or to fulfill his or her capabilities. So we see that this approach is fundamentally located within the idea of social justice. So as mentioned, Sen proposes that people lose capabilities when they lack freedom. Having freedom provides the space to develop capabilities, and therefore all development, according to him, is a development of human capabilities in the enabling environment of freedom. So here we link the ideas of poverty being alleviated, issues of equity, equality, justice, democracy, freedom. All these come together and constitute a more holistic idea of development rather than a strictly economic aspect or strictly an economic approach to the idea of development. The capabilities approach was utilized to formulate the Human Development Index in 1990 by the United Nations Development Programme, or the UNDP, to assess a nation's or a society's level of well-being. And we see that the Human Development Index has played a major role in promoting alternative ideas about development and welfare, covering dimensions of material well-being, health, and education. So, having spoken in detail about issues like poverty, development, the multidimensional nature of poverty, the various historical, social, economic, cultural dimensions of poverty, let's talk a little bit about what role NGOs play in development. So first and foremost, NGOs have a very important role to play in the welfare of marginalized groups like Dalits, like women, children, scheduled tribes, the elderly, persons with disabilities, and so on. So it is here that NGO initiatives to really take the interests or really foreground the interests of these neglected sections plays a very, very vital and important role. NGOs also play an important role in encouraging people's participation in the various programs and schemes of governments. So as we know, the state, governments of the day have a very, very important role in welfare, in providing welfare to the large mass of the population. However, NGOs can lend a hand to these schemes, can lend a partnering hand to governments of the day by involving people, by including people, by reaching out to people, because at the grassroots level, they are much more closely associated with people, they are much more familiar with people in their local constituencies. And hence, encouraging people to participate becomes a very, very important role played by NGOs. Involving people in planning, in raising resources, in developing programs, in helping to implement programs, and very, very importantly, in playing a role in ensuring equitable distribution of the benefits of development is also a very important role that NGOs can be involved in. And of course, awareness raising, organizing people and groups, organizing marginal communities to be aware of their rights, to mobilize for their rights and entitlements, and to give a voice to voiceless sections of the society is a very, very important role played by NGOs. In conclusion, we can say that poverty is one of the biggest impediments to sustainable development and social justice. NGOs have a major role to play in ridding society of poverty and deprivation by working with the marginalized and excluded individuals and communities and helping to enhance their capabilities. I hope that this talk has given you a deeper insight on the issues of poverty which confront many societies like us, and will enable you to understand the concept better so that your work with people who experience poverty, exclusion and marginalization can be enhanced and can become deeper and richer. Thank you so much.